Welcome to the Conversation Circle, where we circle governance issues with the people. Today, we continue on our governance journey or good governance journey, where we look at the separation of powers in Botswana. We have started our journey on good governance with explaining what government is, what to be governed is all about, our responsibilities, our rights, and what governance is, and how we all have to play a role. We also then looked at democratic institutions last week, where we learned about the 5 pillars or the 5 boxes in the process of democracy, and how all those boxes work together for the common good. So today, we thought we could actually look at the first box that Regatolo spoke about when he looked at the codes and values that we must adhere to. And one of those would be the principle of separation of powers, or the doctrine of separation of powers. Now, the question is the separation of powers a feature of the Botswana constitutional system? Or is it just merely an abstract philosophical inheritance that lacks both content and relevance to the realities of the country today? To what extent does the doctrine operate within the executive, the legislature, and the judicial branches? How does it strengthen the pillars of constitutionalism and good governance? So with me today, I have Tshimologo Matlaga. You have seen her before. She graced our conversation, the very first episode. So thank you very much, Tshimologo, for joining us again, for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And we also have Rekia Leboga Dipogiso. For the very first time. So thank you for making the time during the lockdown.
I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. So these two work at the University of Botswana, and we thought, why don't we bring impartial, neutral people who know more about these things to look into the issue of separation of powers and why it is important. Now, the first question is, what is separation of powers? Tshimologo.
All right. Thank you so much again just for having me. Really appreciate the invitation. So just to what the separation of powers is really, when we talk about the government, or when we talk about the government branches, there are different functions that each branch of government has. So I don't know if you guys have covered this already, but just looking at the fact that we have a legislature, that makes and amends your laws. You have your executive that implements government, policies, and then we have your judiciary that adjudicates, or that essentially implements the law. So we have those 3 separate, branches of government that have different roles. So when we speak about the separation of powers, it's just that each of those branches of government, their powers are separate. So no one branch should be performing the work of another. That's first of all. And then second of all, it's just that, there should be a distinction as well in personnel. But obviously we'll speak about it in the Botswana case about how there isn't that distinction. But in the ideal scenario, you would have that, you don't have an overlap of people within those 3 branches. So the whole idea is that each of those 3 branches that I've spoken about, they have different functions, and so they're able to carry out their functions independently, and they're able to carry out their functions without the overlap of personnel, which allows them to be independent, which allows things like transparency to happen, and all those things. But yeah, just as a beginning, that's a very foundational idea of what we mean by separation of powers.
All right. Thank you very much. Redipogiso, would you like to add on what Tshimologo just said?
I don't think there's anything much that one could add. She has mentioned a lot, I think everything that requires to be mentioned. Importantly, the issue of autonomy, that these three arms have to be autonomous from each other. And the fact that they are set for a specific purpose, which purpose have to be performed without interference of the other branch on another. And the one important thing is that these arms are created for the purpose of a proper functioning government. As we all know that in government, there has to be decisions taken to regulate behavior, and where there are problems of conflicts, there has to be one who mediates, which are the judiciary, and there has to be a lawmaker who is particularly responsible for making the laws. And then there also has to be one who executes these particular laws. But as she mentions, there are quite diversity in terms of how these particular institutions are managed across the world.
Okay, so now let's just
Yes.
simplify. How is separation of powers mo Botswana? And what are the different scenarios? Like let's take the branch here, the legislature and the executive. Can we say there is a separation there of powers when it comes to the separation in terms of distinct, independent functions of those two branches? Can we say there is a separation?
So I think the one thing that we want to read, or just to clarify, is that in terms of our constitution, we do have a separation of powers. So even though the idea or the term doesn't feature in the constitution, but the reality is that how is our constitution you'll find there are different sections in the constitution. They outline executive, who makes up the executive, etc. They outline legislature and the same with the judiciary. So how the constitution, there is a separation in the sense that the three arms of government, their powers and their duties in the sense of just the constitution, they are separate. So I think on that basic level, the idea of the separation of powers, we see it coming out in our constitution. But then looking at how does that play out, how is that applied in Botswana? We would then look at what kind of system do we have, because if you look at the system across the world, you have parliamentary systems, you have presidential systems, and you have hybrids. And so what you find is that in a system like ours, it's often said to be parliamentary/hybrid. You'll find that there's an overlap, meaning that but they are part of your executive, they also make up the legislature. So unlike other systems, like a presidential system like America, for example, the legislature and the executive are entirely separate. You won't find legislature, executive. There's that clean distinction. We don't have that here. So in as much as there is a separation of powers based on our constitution, there is an overlap, particularly in terms of personnel that make up the executive and the legislature.
All right, so maybe you can then add to why is it important to have that clear, distinct functions between the executive and the legislature, and what could be the implications of not having, say, the executive in the legislature? What are the implications? So this is to both of you, but that could already.
Yes, I think that's a very critical question when it comes to this particular topic, that you have to have these distinct arms of government performing their duties devoid of interference from one another. Now, the implication that Mematla has just described is that once we have a person sitting in cabinet and sitting in parliament at the same time, then you won't have that autonomy that we talked about earlier. because one of the functions of the legislature is to make laws and also to hold cabinet to account to actions, to its actions, to to whatever actions are there or whatever programs, policies, etc. are there. But then you find in the case of Botswana, a legislature that is bloated with members of the executive, those that sit in the executive in the morning and then in the afternoon go to parliament. Now, the problem is that you hardly expect them to hold themselves to account on issues that they would have acted upon in cabinet. So gone mo hela go supa gore go na le go sa nna sentle ga separation of powers mo lehatsheng la rona ka gore ga re solohetse gore government's programs, expenditure issues, etc. That robust debate as to how things are going on in government. You have the same people, in the executive, in the legislature, and I think, as you might all know, executive ya rona intsi gona le batho ba bantsi teng, gona le minister tse dintsi. I don't know the numbers. I think there are about 30 or so. But that makes almost half of the whole legislature. So that is a problem. According to me, it's a problem because I don't think they can easily hold themselves to account to their own actions. One aspires a situation where a different set of people holding those in cabinet to account.